Well, good morning. Thank you for being here. You're not aware of this, but I have no budget for doing church planting week. You know what that means? These men come at their own expense. So why would they do that?
I thought you were paying us back.
Matt says, I thought you were paying us to come. Well, there'll be a check in the mail, Matt. What was your...
Yeah. It's not that bad. Yeah. Aubrey bought me a salad in the bookstore over there.
Last of the big spenders here on campus, I think. I'm not sure if you're aware of how the church, especially the evangelical church, is doing right now in America. If you're thinking not well, you're thinking correctly. Just a few statistics, and Matt hit you with a number of them yesterday. 9 out of 10 churches are either plateaued or in decline. And I don't know how you are about statistics. I'm throwing them at you, but I went to the University of Florida, which is not a Christian school by any means, even though I came to faith on that campus. And there I learned that statistics are lies and liars use statistics. So I don't know what you want to do with some of these, but the word out there is 9 out of 10 on good research. But let's say 5 out of 10. That's still too many, is it not? The number of church people right now is right around 17%. And the number of young people, young adults between the ages of 16 and 29, 60% of them are leaving our churches. And so there's our leadership, our future leadership, not only as a country, as a nation, but in terms of our churches. We're hurting. So enough of the problem. What might be the solution to this? And one of the best solutions to this is church planting. Now, there are 2 other things that we can do. We call it church revitalization. We're doing a lot of research on that right now. I've got a book coming out here in a week or 2 on what we discovered when we researched 150 turnaround pastors. And we discovered that they are wired a certain way and they can do it. But we don't have enough of them. Another is church acquisitions. And that is a stronger, spiritually minded church adopting one of these smaller, struggling churches and taking it under its wing. But of all of those, the most powerful, the most successful approach is church planting. Some of you may be involved in church revitalization or church planting. One gentleman said the difference between the two is the difference between having babies and trying to raise the dead. And that's probably a pretty accurate description. So you choose what you want to do. But we offer church planting here next semester, so we got room for you. This is a time for you, and I'm already taking more of your time than I want. And we want your questions. I'm going to start off with a prime the pump question, and then feel free to come up to one of these mics and ask your questions. These men will know the answers to them. But to begin with, men, let's just assume our students here have been sitting here listening to you preach this week, and some of them are thinking, no, maybe I need to investigate this a little bit. What would you advise them to do? How might they follow up this week?
Well, I'm a little biased because I run an organization that works with church planters. Was a church planter, but Aubrey, I think it needs to really begin, obviously, in prayer. Do I have the giftedness and do I have the calling to plant a church? And don't rule it out too fast, because a calling takes time. It's a process. Every calling there's fear immediately. I can't do this. I'm not capable of this. That's a good thing. Because it keeps you dependent on God. So I would say begin with that. Begin to study church planting as much as you can, and then go visit some church plants to get the exposure that you need. Visit some healthy, growing churches. Go visit some church plants. And I promise you, what will happen is God will begin to birth a vision and a passion in your heart. My last 9 months here, I quit my job and I went to probably 10 different, we'd go to one church, went to Lake Point, stayed there for a month, went to Prestonwood, stayed there for a month, went to some small churches, stayed there for a month. And just that developed my philosophy of ministry and gave me a vision for church planting and reaching the lost.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. What I would say is, I'd say go to a church and beg them to give you a seat at the table. and don't stop until you get to the highest seat you can, and just tell them, I'll do anything you want me to do. I just want to be in the room. That's what I do.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. To find a church that has a heart for planting and go get involved and be willing to sweep floors, do whatever they tell you to do, and then let them have exposure to you. And I think getting exposure is part of it too. You need to see what's out there. But let a church kind of have authority in your life. Let them learn who you are, see what your gifts are, and then they say, oh, yes, we plant churches, and this is what you are wired to do too, and we will help launch you, move you in that direction. And then you have, as you were talking about, the level of success that increases with having someone who sends you, who cares about you, and who has trained you is very important.
Yes.
How do you evaluate your calling geographically or locationally? If I feel for the past 5 or 6 years, I felt like evangelism through church planting has been what God has called me to. How do you begin to work out the where of that? How do you kind of triangulate, well, I like this place, but they need this place, and my church is saying this place. Like, how do you work all that out?
Well, some of these guys went back home, in essence. Didn't you do that, Matt? You went back. He had a burden for, and for a while here at the seminary, I can recall, I've been here for a long time, by the way. And you're saying you look like it, but I can remember there was a time here on campus where for some reason students were thinking, God wouldn't let me go back home, would he? So I need to think of going somewhere else. And I think we've gotten through that now. But maybe you have a passion for home and you're going to know the culture of back home a lot better than perhaps another culture.
Yeah, I don't think that's unspiritual. I mean, I think sometimes God tells people. He just tells them, I want you to go here, and you go there. I think sometimes your church has authority in this situation, and they say, you're with us, this is what we're doing, so that you're doing that. And so there can be an authoritative piece. And then for us, it was, this is where we come from, there's a need here, we speak the vernacular, we have the accent, we understand the culture, the context, the denominational world, we have all that. And I said in my talk the other day, I went to Colorado for a few days, Vicki and I did, and I went from town to town meeting people, and all they did was make fun of how I talked. I was like, well, this ain't going to work. Right? Like, we're not playing a church here. So it was people that we cared about. It was people that we cared about, so we wanted to go reach them. So I don't think it's unspiritual for the Jews in the early church to care about the Jewish context. And Paul says he's both. I got to reach these, and I'm going to the Gentiles. So that is both things.
I would really start by thinking that just what they're saying, because indigenous church planting is most effective, means church planting. But some guys are called to go and drop in somewhere else. So I would start with where's home? Who do I know? What's my level of passion there? But then if you feel like God's calling you somewhere where there is a greater need, and I think it's 40% of the lost people in this nation live in the West. And you go to the West and you just can't find churches, and it's sad. And so we need men, and we need people going out to the West desperately. So if you do feel called to a place where you've never lived and you don't have a lot of connections, start building a team now. Cast a vision, get people to go with you, because the most successful church plants that go somewhere and drop in like that take 20, 30, 40 people with them. Go get you a singles ministry, work as a singles pastor for 2 or 3 years, build up loyalty, build up some leaders, and say, hey, I got a vision for, and go with me, and a lot of them will up and move. I've watched it over and over and over. People up and move to go with you to share the gospel. It's amazing.
I don't think the question is where. I really don't. I think the question is, am I called? And I think the question is what I call, am I a number one or a number two? I think if you're a number one leader, which means you're directional in your temperament, I think he will burden you for a location. And I think you will know what that location is. I was convinced I was going to Jamaica. I was convinced. Nobody could tell me nothing. I married my wife knowing she was going to Jamaica to be poor. That's what I married her saying. Hey, you're going to be poor for the rest of your life. Let's go. And we did a lot of things. We went there 4 times a year. But when it came down to it, all the doors there closed. And he showed me crystal clearly that I can do more for the country here than I can there. That's the only reason why I'm here. And then that also influenced where I went, because I knew I didn't want a black church, because then I'd be in Jamaica. if I needed a black church. It needed to be diverse at some level. So if you heard the story in my sermon, I said I went to the place where they had the least amount of black people. That's where we started. It had nothing spiritual about it, least amount of black people. That was the criteria. All right?
You're probably familiar with Rick Warren, and Rick took an interesting approach. He did a demographic study. He wanted to go to the fastest growing areas because he knew that people were a little more open to spiritual things in fast growing areas than people who have settled into another location for a period of time, and that's how he ended up in California. Back then, the fastest growing areas were California, Florida, and Texas, and he settled into California. That was his approach. Another question. Yes.
So probably within the past couple weeks, I've really felt the thought of looking into planning a church. All my life, it's kind of been like, no, go to where the churches are. We have enough churches, don't need more. But if you look at the statistics, like you said, out west, there's very few churches. So with this, I feel really excited about this potential call from God, but definitely really nervous. And so the question I have for you guys is, one, what would you say would be the biggest differences between working in an established church and church planning? And then two, what were some of the biggest obstacles that you guys had to overcome in doing that?
Let me go. Here's the obstacles I had to overcome. I never wanted to plant a church. I never did. I really did. I wanted to go help leaders get better. So for me, when it became clear that that's the direction which God was leading me, I was fearful. But I was fearful all in the flesh. I was fearful of whether people would laugh at me. I didn't think I could preach that good. So I thought, I'm just, when you're comparing yourself to Tony Evans, which is where the church I went to, I'm like, I suck. So nobody wants to hear me. What do they want to hear me about? Where am I going? You can hear Tony Evans, you in Dallas. What? I need to get out of here. I don't want to stay here. And so fear was one of mine. Another one was, would anybody show up? I honestly thought if I had 100 people, I'd have a mega church, and I was excited if 100 people would show up. And 100 people didn't show up the first time, like 30 did. And so fear was one that I had to overcome. Number two was the resource question. Were you going to get the resources to pull it off? And were you willing to be poor for the rest of your life? And were you willing to take your family through that? And were they okay? And were they really on board for the next 20 years if you had to work 3 jobs to pull it off? I had to work through that. And then the last one, I think, for me was who would want to do this with you? Who would want to give everything up? And for our context, we had to say, because we didn't want to hurt the church we're a part of, we told them, if you don't live north of 635, you can't come. And unless you pick up everything and move up there. And we had about 8 people do it. And we're pumped that 8 came. We're just like, yeah, let's change the world. So those were the 3 that initially were my fears, and God showed up big time in all 3.
I'll take the first part of your question, which is what is the difference? And if you go into an existing church, you have existing structures, existing patterns that you have to deal with, traditions that you have to deal with. And as a lead pastor, that may shackle you some. Whereas in a church plant, it's a blank slate. And you get to cast a vision and build what you feel like God's calling you to build. The other big difference is in a church plant, you're going to reach, for every 100 people you get, you're going to baptize 10 new believers. A church that's 15 years old, you're going to baptize 1.5 new believers for every 100 people. 35 years old, the church typically plateaus and declines. Every church is born and every church dies. Look at the churches that Paul planted. They're one of the most effective church planters in history, right? Every single one of those churches are dead. They're gone. Churches have a life cycle. In the early stages, they're extremely effective at reaching the lost. They're agile. They're flexible. And so to me, if you have a heart to reach the lost, get involved in church planting, because you're going to be able to do that much quicker than you would in an established church.
Our church is not going to die. You're dumb.
I just broke bad news to Matt.
You're an idiot.
Here's the key, Matt. You leave in year 15. That way it's the other guy's fault. When Matt left, it all went downhill.
I wouldn't add anything. I mean, what you said was my life. I mean, riddled with fear. Can I do this? How are you going to eat? I mean, those are big questions. So I couldn't add anything.
One distinction is when you go into an established church, you're joining them, whereas when you're church planting, they're joining you. And there's a huge difference between the two. Yes.
Hey, I got a couple of questions for you guys. I'm just curious about this. What percentage of church plants actually survive? And
You don't want to ask that question.
and my second question is more just a thought I had when I heard one of you guys speak. And that was, I read Barna's book, Revolution, and they say that the church is actually moving away from like the traditional church to more of a home church setting. And I'm just curious to what you guys would have to say about that and what you see in your life. Like, what is the future of church planting maybe? Maybe it's more house churches, or is it still the traditional model?
May I grab that first one? Ed Stetzer has addressed this. If you don't know that name, just park it somewhere in your minds. And if you see his name on the cover of a book, he's a personal friend of mine, then pick that book up and read it. And he's done a lot of research, has been his approach. And for a while, the word out there is that church plants fail right and left. And he did some actual research on this, and he said that's not really the case. I think he came up with about a 70 or 80% success rate in church planting. So for the longest time, the word out there was that we're planting churches, but they're failing quickly. And he says not the case.
92 survived the first year, 92%. I think it's 86% survive year 2. When you get to year 4, 68% have survived. So there is a 32% failure rate in the first 4 years. That's not bad.
Yeah. Compared to the established churches are just failing right and left. Somebody said something a while ago too about there are a lot of churches out there. They used to say that about Dallas, and I said, but have you visited any of those churches? There's always a place for a new church with a new vision that God is giving to some church planter, maybe you. And it's telling you, go. There's room for you. There's plenty of room for you there.
Yeah, no, it's gotten better. But the reason it's gotten better is because of the networks that are sending people that are restricting some people from just going out there because they're lusting after somebody else's ministry. So part of the beauty of it is the group and the networks that are sending people now and making sure they have the calling and the skill sets to pull it off, which is why I believe that percentage is up. It was way down before the advent of these networks.
We'll have 200 guys go through assessment this year. Only 100 will pass. So we only pass 50%.
Barna's book, we read it when it came out. And it was, it's disturbing. You're like, oh gosh, and here we are. And we've used a lot of Barna's material. It's been very helpful. I do think he missed it there. And here's what I think he missed. I think he confused the emergence of something with the replacement of something. I think he saw the emerging of house church and some of the reaction against mega this and mega that and impersonal this and programs, that there was an emergence of something. And I think where he mistakenly thought was, this is going to replace this. And I don't think he's turned out to be wrong on that. That has not happened. We are growing in large churches. The number of large churches now is greater than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and that trend continues. I don't think that means that is all that there is. There is that part of it, of the church landscape, and there's a room for super large churches and medium-sized churches and small churches. I do not think that any of those segments of the church population are going away. I just think the house church was a hot movement for a while, and I think people got confused in thinking, oh, something's going to die and this is going to take over, and that did not happen. I think that there's room for all of that, and I think that sometimes Christians will see something emerge and think, oh, this is what's happening, this is taking over, and that is more complex than that, and I think that's where he missed it in that book.
No, let me speak a little bit, and it might be going against it just a tad. Let me tell you. So I think if you process as a futurist, and if you do scenario plannings of the future, and you just try to come up with a world of what if in the future, I think you've got to be careful as to how many people you can genuinely disciple. So I think from a leadership perspective, you've got to be careful about how many people you can genuinely disciple. And then secondly, in light of that, the model that's being emerging now is this whole multi-site model, which means you can disciple fewer people better. So if you really are owning the responsibility of discipleship, and if you process the future and what could happen, just what could happen, scary scenarios, then you better have a model that can work with a large setting and with a small setting. So, for example, when we decided to build a building, we intentionally didn't build 3,000 because we just thought that 1,800 was sufficient, and then you go out from there just to maintain an agile, small, we can disciple you kind of environment, so that we're not burdened with an overhead that's so great that if something happens, just something bad happens in the future, you can't handle it with yeah, let me stop right there. Just process that.
We would totally agree with that. That's a good word. We totally agree.
If you've listened and you're listening to these men, you'll hear the word assessment pop up in there and calling and all that. Let me say this, it's very important, that who is as important as how. Now, most people take my church planting course because they want to learn how to plant a church. And again, we've discovered who is as important. Not everybody can plant a church. Not everybody in this room can plant a church. Most of you can, but that's what assessment is about. We've studied men who have gone out and God has blessed them in church planting and church revitalization. And we've discovered there are patterns to each one. Now, again, I'm really big on church planting here, but another area I'm starting to wave the flag for is church revitalization, because church planting alone is not going to get the job done, and we need to re-envision some of these established churches, and it can be done, but even there, who is as important as how? So keep that in mind. Yes?
Yes, sir. I'm glad you made that statement, because that was my question. I was wondering, you said you studied a few of the leaders, and they're wired for raising the dead, so to speak. And I was wondering, would you mind sharing a few of those qualities that you've observed that makes them wired for that?
Yeah. What we've done is we've used some tools. For example, most of you are familiar with the DISC, because we use that a lot here, and also the Myers-Briggs. And we used those, and we had them take them, and church revitalization people and church planters both tend to be DNIs on the DISC or IDs, typically. And the Myers-Briggs, they tend to be extroverts, and they tend to be intuitive types, sensing types, and they're judgment type. I'm using Myers-Briggs terminology, and I use the judgment, and you might say, oh, but they mean something. They mean very organized and orderly. So that's what we've discovered with those. We also came up with a tool. We have 15 questions that we ask, and they're heavily mixed in with vision. Vision is a very important part of that. I think one of the reasons why so many churches are failing right now is they've lost their vision. The average pastoral stay now is about 3.6 years. Youth, it's 18 months, but 3.6 years before they move on. And what happens in that process is the church loses the vision. And I think it's the vision that motivates people to want to be a part of God's mission for the church. And we've lost that vision, so we're talking about re-envisioning our churches.
I'll address that real quick too, because we assess so many church planters through the launch group, and the things we're looking for. I mean, if you're looking, you go, am I a church planter or am I not? Okay, one, there has to be this pull that you cannot resist. It's the Holy Spirit just pulling you to do it. You just cannot resist it. There's a passion that you do not manufacture. It's not, you're talking yourself into it. There's just a passion you don't manufacture. There is a pattern of multiplication in your life. If you've not reproduced a small group, you are not going to reproduce a church. So get out in ministry and start reproducing leaders. If you've never reproduced a leader, then you don't need to be trying to start a church. There's a pattern of multiplication. Church planter is all about multiplication. There's got to be buy-in from your spouse. If she says no, if there's a sense of hesitation, do not go. I don't care how much you want to go. Don't go. Your spouse has to be bought into this. She has to have the same level of peace that you do around that calling, and so if she's lagging behind, wait. That's God's indicator to you. Don't go do this. There has to be people who are confirming you, other than your mama, okay? It's people coming up to you. It's people coming up to you and going, hey, have you ever thought about planting a church? You need to be leading your own church. You need to start something. There are people who are begging you, go start a church. And then there's got to be this entrepreneurial personality. There's an entrepreneurial personality that goes into that can take the risk, get people to follow the vision. If people aren't following your current vision, they're not going to follow your vision for church plant. And so you got to look behind you, and is anybody following you? If the answer is yes, then hey, that's a really good sign. And then go start something other than a church. Go start something to see if you have that entrepreneurial personality. We don't pass guys all the time. We tell them, your next step is to go start something other than church. Once you find out you can start something, then come back and talk to us and see if you can start church.
I'll say two things to that. One is, when I look at guys that come through a church, I want to see how far into the future they can see. I want to see how far, because if they can't save money for the next 5 years for their personal life, they can't do it for the church. If they can't see further into the future than just their own selves, then they will not survive. Number two, how many complex problems can they handle at the same time? Because if they can't handle 10 simultaneous crises at the same time, God bless you, you're not going to make it. Now.
Now you were going to run everybody off. You shouldn't have told them that. These are secrets of church planting, not for this. Hold on.
That's where you go to the existing church to get the practice.
Silence that man.
Now, the only thing I'll say, it depends on what size church you believe God's calling you to. No, if the church is a church of 100 or 150, then you don't have to deal with that many complex problems. But the larger it gets, I promise you, you got to be able to deal with 10 of them at the same time and not go crazy. Can I get a witness, somebody?
It's not even not go crazy.
Y'all being silent with me. Can I get a witness?
Well, and my wife has said to me numerous times, I feel like you're not happy unless there's a crisis. Right? And so, Andrew Jackson said, I was built for the storm. The calm does not suit me. And so there is a part of it that you actually are happier when there's something to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you could address, for us girls who are here this week and are learning, church plant sounds like a good thing, or church revitalization. What would the role for a woman look like, saying that we can't be senior pastors?
These men, a couple of them have their wives with them. Almost let your wives answer the question, but...
Will you come up? Oh, you can stand at the mic and answer. She's right beside you. What's the role of the church plant wife and other women that would like to be involved?
This is Cindy Lake.
I can't speak necessarily to the woman being the senior pastor, because I don't know anything about that. But what I can speak to is the role as the wife. And first of all, what Mac just shared, I think is most important, that you are a team. And if it is a calling, a true calling of God, you will both sense that calling. Now, you won't, the intensity of that calling won't be the same, but what Mac said is true. There will be a peace there. In our experience, Mac was so passionate, and he was excited, and things were just going off in his mind, and he could not wait. I had an incredible amount of peace, but I had no idea what we were doing. I did not feel called to Carolina Forest. Now, the intensity for me grew as when we moved there and we got integrated in the community, and so that was a growing process for me, but we were a team. And I think it's most important that you see that your role in this is just as invaluable, just as valuable as your husband. But I would say, men, your wife is your biggest asset, but she is your first ministry. She comes before the church. Your children, if you have been blessed with children, come before the church. And so whatever that looks like in creating boundaries to keep your family first and whole. And women, men, help your wife to be who God created her to be. She is not going to look like any other pastor's wife you've ever come across. And so help her know how God wired her, her passion, her gifts, her abilities, her personality, and you give her the freedom to serve the Lord in the way that God created her to be. And don't you ever put expectations on her that are not meant to be there. So you love her first, and you let her thrive in the role that God's called her to be. If she doesn't like other people's children, then you protect her. Don't put her in the nursery. I think that's pretty, I could go on forever. And I'm sitting here burning inside because I want to speak to every woman, but it's not about me.
She puts church plant guys in their place all the time. I love it.
When you go as a wife, when you go as a wife into a lot of smaller established church situations, there will be expectations of the wife. And I tell my guys, settle that before you go in, but really you don't settle it because the people in the church, the board may say, well, that's okay, but the people there will have expectations. It usually comes from the former pastor's wife and what she did, play the piano, teach class, that kind of thing.
Now, I will say that church planning is a different type of deal. So you do have to have something about you that says, I am willing to step into this role for a very short time. And hopefully, if you are called to plant a church, that leadership development is utmost up top. And so that you're always looking to raise up leaders, so that if you do have to step into a role that you're not necessarily wired to do, it's for a very short time. Because if you just church planning, there are things, you are going to have to put some chairs out and do some things that, but it's short-lived.
Yeah. Vicki Williams is here. Vicki, you want to add to that, or?
No, I would just echo, I guess, most of those sentiments. Going into a church plant, I would say the beauty of it was that there were no expectations from people as to what role I had to play. And so that was really great, and has been the whole entire process. I've been able to be involved in what I was kind of choosing to be involved in, and things that I was excited about. However, I would say that it is true when you're coming together as a team, and definitely at the beginning, just being involved in whatever needed to be done. And a lot of times, I think the other role you play as a wife too, if you do have children, is recognizing that. For me, my role was, my husband had an important role with the church, and part of my ministry was actually managing our family and taking care of our kids so he could go do setup at the church, because we had two small, little bitties kind of needing to nap before church and trying to get there. And so we would go to church separately, and I'm left at home and brought the children, an hour later so he could go do setup and a lot of things like that. And all that's changed now. And of course, our children are a lot older. So our oldest, that was a toddler at the time, is a sophomore in college now. So, so I think it's definitely a team effort though. And wife needs to be on board and involved and doing her part.
Thank you.
I would say that for the gal who's single or maybe married and someone else who's not the church planter, can a woman be a part of the team? I absolutely think so. There's leadership gifts, there's administrative gifts, there's mercy gifts, there's shepherding gifts. Women have very powerful gifts, just like men do. We're restrained in some theological ways, but the gifts transfer. And there was a time where we lost 2 staff within a very short amount of time. And so the gal who was supposed to be the administrative assistant was on the front desk, was very young. Her name was Joanna. And for a number of months, she and I ran that church. And so we'd sit down, our staff meeting was the 2 of us. And she was really solving 50-60% of the issues that were going on in our church administratively. She was just handling all that and keeping that off me so I could teach and go do the shepherding pieces that I had to do. And we couldn't have sustained that forever, but she wound up playing a critical role for us during a very difficult season.
Last question. Go ahead.
I think that most churches miss this, that singles is the most potent resource in God's army. And they are overlooked for a myriad of reasons. About 75% of the people that started with us were all single. And so, or corporate administrator who is here today, she ran everything. She left her law firm she was in law at TI, and she left to come start with us. And I'm telling you, from incorporation to everything, she ran the entire administrative side of our church. And so you're unwise to try and plant without passionate, God-honoring single men and women that want to take a hill for Jesus. I think the church has overlooked them because most married guys have been there for a minute and they just don't know how to relate to them. And I think it's one of the biggest mistakes churches make.
Last question.
That's good. I just kind of going back to what you said about a calling and it being a process. I'm just curious to you guys, apart from seminary, what do you think were some of the biggest things that helped prepare you for where you are today? You know, were you discipled by a church planter, or like what was that? What did that look like for you guys?
I'll answer that first. For me, I got a seat at the table, man, and I was at the table with Dr. Evans, and he allowed me to see what they do. And a lot of the things that I don't do today is because I learned from him what not to do. A lot of the things that I do today is because I learned from him what you should do. There are about 4 guys in my life that have really shaped me, and there are a lot of things you just can't learn from school. You got to be in it, which is why my best advice to you is go to a church where they'll give you a seat at the table, and not at the lower table, at the highest possible table, and say, I will do whatever y'all need. I just need a seat. And don't say nothing. Shut up. And just listen. The benefit is you should be grateful that they allow you in the room. And don't come up with your little stuff you learned last week at DTS. Shut up and just listen. And every day you see them, say thank you for letting me in the room. And if you disagree with something, say, okay, I shouldn't do that. But don't tell nobody. Just know that you shouldn't do it.
Become familiar, and I don't have time to go into this, but become familiar with the leadership pipeline. Basically, leadership pipeline says you have to first learn to lead yourself. Then you learn to lead others. Then you flow up and learn to lead leaders. Then you lead a department. Then you can lead the organization. You cannot skip steps in that pipeline. And so I guarantee you, we've not talked, but I guarantee you, each one of us learn first to lead ourselves. Then we learn to lead a small group of others. Then we learn to lead leaders. Then all of a sudden we were on staff and begin to lead a department. And then we led the organization. And if you skips, you're in trouble. And here's the thing. We wrote a church plant training, and the whole thing is built around 12 leadership competencies, because there's a lot of guys out there, and I see this over and over and over. They're godly men, and they're called, and they're sincere, and they're authentic, and they're getting out there, and they're failing, and it's not a spiritual issue. It's not a contextual issue. They're going the wrong place or something. It's a leadership issue. While you're here, the best thing that ever happened to me here was taking Dr. Hendrick's leadership class. Yeah. And he made us read Leadership and the 1 Minute Manager, not 1 Minute Manager, Leadership and 1 Minute Manager. And I read that and it blew my mind. And I was like, oh my goodness, I've never learned to lead this way. And study leadership, learn leadership, go lead, learn your way up the pipeline. And that's going to be the best thing. It rises and falls on leadership. Go learn to lead. You know a lot, but go learn to lead.
And what they're saying is the opposite of what a lot of us were taught, a hyper-spiritualized view that you're going to be like Moses. You're going to be somewhere in the desert, and God's going to appear to you, and then that's going to be your moment of calling, and that's going to solve all your future problems. And interesting, even in our context, I heard that at Dallas Seminary from students and different people, but you realize that the point, Moses' question to God was, what will I say to the elders? How will I get this past the real leadership here? And he's like, oh, throw your stick down, become a snake. I mean, that was it wasn't even Pharaoh at that point. Right. So when people say, I got this calling like Moses, I'll be like, you're not doing what he did. It was a unique setting. Do you have a stick you can throw down and become a snake? for the average person, God is speaking to us, He is leading us, but it is a process of being under the authority of a local church, working through a process of going, I really am wired this way, because we're so self-deceived in what we're really able to do. It takes time to discover what you can do. So there's a spiritual component, but I wouldn't hyper-spiritualize it. There's work to be done for a season and a process.
I have one more thought, which is you have to, if you think you can church plant, you have to lead a SF group. Here's why. Because if you can't lead your peers, you can't lead nobody. So wherever you are, if you want to plant a church, I would lead, before I leave here, 2 different ones. I think I led 3. For 2 years, and you go lead your peers, and they're going to hate it. And they're going to say, this is just for community, or whatever they're going to say. But when they say it, if you can't transition their thinking so that they love community by the time they leave, don't plant no church. Because that's all you're doing with a broader group of people. That's all you're doing.
And my last thing, too. Because I want you to get this, because this is so critical. Most of you here are not going to go plant a church. You're not. But many of you here are going to go work for a church. Now listen. Here's the spiritual landscape of our nation right now. Okay, Lifeway did a study, 2010. Less than 4% of U.S. churches are reproducing themselves in church planting. Let that sink in, okay? Now, imagine if less than 4% of U.S. couples were reproducing themselves. The nation would be gone in a generation, and that's where we're headed. That's the spiritual condition of our nation. So some of you are not going to go plant a church, but you are going to a church, and make sure that church becomes a church planting church. Be relentless about it, because healthy organisms reproduce. If your church isn't reproducing, you got a serious question to answer.
Most successful church plants usually have a sponsor church. And I've seen this around here on a number of occasions that gets behind them. They help in the funding of the process and training. They let them lead on the leadership pipeline. They want to see them move along that pipeline. And so we'll close with it. Where are you on the pipeline, by the way, the leadership pipeline that we were just talking about? This is good practical stuff that you need to wrestle with. Again, I want to thank these men for being with us. And bringing your wives. Conway's wife was here Tuesday, and so
she's at a hair appointment now.
Yeah, she's at a hair appointment. All right. Well, having said that, you never know what you're going to get when you invite people to come here. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for these men and their love for the school and their love for those who are here this morning, for students and for faculty, and the appreciation they have for all that's been built into their lives while here, and all that you've done in their lives since they've been away from here, since they've left. We realize that your Spirit is working on some hearts right now, and questions are being asked. God, how have you wired me? How have you shaped me? What would you have me to do? We know that numerous people are wrestling with that, Father, and we just pray that you'd give them the wisdom and insight that would help them to find out just where you would have them be. And we ask that in Jesus' name, amen.